New Year's Day, 2023. Most people were shaking off hangovers, eating leftover party food or making half-hearted resolutions. But inside the Walsh home in Cohasset, Massachusetts, an upscale little seaside town where old money meets picture-perfect charm, something darker was unfolding. That morning, 39-year-old Anna Walshy supposedly rushed out the door telling her husband, Brian, that she had a sudden work emergency in Washington, D.C. She kissed him goodbye, slid into an Uber, and was gone. At least, that's the story Brian told. The thing was, no one else ever saw her leave. No Uber records, no flight tickets, no co-workers expecting her. Nothing. Anna, the Serbian-born real estate executive who had carved out a career among some of the biggest names in the property world, had simply vanished. And it didn't take long for her employer to notice. By January 4th, after she failed to show up at her job in DC, Tishman Speyer called the police. Officers drove out to the Walsh home where Brian casually explained that his wife had left days ago for work. He didn't seem panicked. He didn't seem worried. He just carried on. But Anna wasn't just a missing employee. She was also the mother of 3 little boys, aged 2 to 6. To her friends, it was impossible to believe she'd simply walked away from them. Something wasn't right, and soon enough, the picture-perfect life of the Walsh family began to crack open, revealing a story filled with scams, fraud, and some of the most chilling Google searches police had ever seen. The first red flag came almost immediately. Detectives checked Anna's supposed travel plans. There was no flight booked, no train ticket, no Uber driver who ever picked her up that morning. Brian's version of events just didn't exist anywhere outside his own mouth. And the more investigators dug, the stranger his behaviour looked. Instead of staying home and worrying about his missing wife, Brian was out running errands, not normal errands either. Surveillance cameras caught him at a Home Depot on January 2nd, just one day after Anna supposedly left. He was wearing a mask and gloves, pushing around a cart filled with cleaning supplies, mops, tarps, and buckets, thousands of dollars worth. Meanwhile, detectives started piecing together Anna's final days. Friends recalled her sounding nervous, almost on edge during phone calls. There were whispers she'd been considering leaving Brian, maybe even filing for divorce. And there was another huge problem hanging over the household. Brian himself was already in trouble with the law. He'd been convicted of art fraud and was awaiting sentencing, confined to home detention. The timing, the lies, the spending spree at Home Depot, everything pointed to Brian knowing more than he was letting on. Behind closed doors, investigators were starting to see the story take shape. And it wasn't the story of a wife who walked away. By now, detectives were circling in on Brian. But what really sealed the deal wasn't just the cameras, the lies, or the missing wife. It was his Google searches. See, Brian wasn't exactly subtle. On the very morning Anna disappeared, while his 3 young kids were still at home, he was on the family iPad typing in things like, how long before a body starts to smell? How to dispose of a 115-pound woman's body? Can you be charged with murder without a body? And that was just the beginning. Over the course of January 1st, Brian ran dozens of horrifying searches. Best ways to dismember. How long DNA lasts? Can you identify a body with broken teeth? Each one was a nail in his coffin. When detectives got hold of that iPad, it was like watching someone write their own confession in real time. There was no mystery left about Anna's fate. But the question remained, where was she? And what exactly had Brian done in that house on New Year's Day? The search of the Walsher home turned up some haunting details. In the basement, investigators found a hacksaw, a heavy-duty tarp, buckets, and, most telling, bloodstains that matched Anna's DNA. Even the walls showed signs of cleanup, like someone had tried scrubbing away what happened down there. But Brian hadn't stopped at the house. Detectives tracked his movements after Anna disappeared and discovered he'd gone on a bizarre shopping spree. At Home Depot, he was caught on camera buying thousands of dollars worth of cleaning supplies, mops, tape, tarps, drop cloths, even a hazmat-style suit. And he paid in cash, as if that would somehow erase the evidence. Meanwhile, police combed through dumpsters near the couple's home and at a transfer station. What they pulled out was horrifying. A bloody hacksaw blade, towels soaked in red, a pair of boots, and even a rug that matched one missing from the Walshy house. Piece by piece it became clear. Brian had planned not only Anna's murder but also the cover-up, and yet despite all of this, he still thought he could bluff his way out of it. By mid-January, police had more than enough to move in. Brian Walshy was arrested, not for murder just yet, but for misleading investigators. He had lied repeatedly about his whereabouts, telling police he only left the house to take his kids to get ice cream. But his phone and the security footage told a very different story. Then came the nail in the coffin: his Google search history. On New Year's Day, hours after Anna was last seen alive, Brian had searched, "How long before a body starts to smell?" Minutes later, "How to dismember a body," and "Best ways to clean up blood." The list went on, dozens of searches, each more chilling than the last. It was like reading a step-by-step manual for what he had done. When prosecutors laid this out in court, the judge didn't hesitate. Brian Walsh was charged with the murder of his wife, Anna. The story shocked not just Massachusetts, but the entire world. How a man could Google such things in the same house where his children were sleeping. And still, through it all, Brian pled not guilty. The trial that followed was every bit as chilling as the investigation itself. Prosecutors laid out the timeline piece by piece. The blood found in the basement, the trash bags filled with evidence, the hacksaw and gloves discovered at the transfer station, and of course, the endless Google searches. To them, it was clear Brian Walshy had planned, carried out, and tried to cover up the murder of his wife, Anna. His defense, though, painted a different picture. They argued that Anna had been under stress, living between two worlds, the US and Serbia, and that there was no direct proof of her death. No body, no definitive cause. They tried to plant doubt in the jury's mind. Without a body, how could anyone be certain what had really happened? But the digital evidence was relentless. Every search, every surveillance clip, every contradiction in Brian's own words pulled the case back to the same chilling conclusion. And sitting in that courtroom, you could see it, the jurors leaning forward, following every detail as if even they were struggling to process how calculated it all seemed. Through it all, Brian sat there, stone-faced, not once showing any real emotion, even as prosecutors described in brutal detail the fate they believed Anna had suffered. As the trial wound forward, one truth became painfully clear. Even without a body, the evidence against Brian Walshy was damning. The internet searches alone painted a picture more horrifying than anything the jury could imagine. Add in the blood, the trash bags, the surveillance footage, and it was nearly impossible to see him as anything but guilty. But here's the catch. As of now, this story doesn't have a final ending. Brian Walshy has been formally charged with Anna's murder, yet he hasn't been sentenced. His trial is ongoing, and the world is waiting to hear what the jury will decide. If convicted, Massachusetts law is clear: life in prison without parole, no second chances, no getting out. Meanwhile, Brian is already serving time for a completely different crime, an art fraud scheme that landed him a 37-month federal sentence. It's ironic. While he was busy scamming others, his own house of lies was quietly collapsing from within. As for Anna, her body has never been found. Her family in Serbia is still left with nothing but grief and unanswered questions. Her 3 children are growing up without their mother, and without their father too. So, while the case of Brian Walshy is technically still unfolding, one thing is certain: no matter how the trial ends, the true victims of this story are 3 little kids who will never see their mum again.